So I've had this camera, the Leica Q2, for about a year now, and this is by far the most expensive camera that I've ever bought, and it is probably also the most used camera that I've ever had, at least in terms of photography, not including the video side of things. I have taken this guy everywhere I could. I carried it with me in my day-to-day life in my EDC bag, but I also took it on a bunch of trips over the past 12 months, and I shot a ton of photos with it. And after all that, I do have a bunch of things to say about it. Just very quickly, in case you're new to this channel, I want to let you know where I'm coming from in terms of my camera experience. I started out as a Canon 70D shooter in 2014 and switched to Fuji's APS-C system in 2019. Back then, I first had a Fuji X100F as well as an X-T30. When the Fuji X100V dropped, just a couple of months later, I immediately jumped on it, used it for about 2 years, and then bought the Leica Q2. So in other words, I do have quite a bit of shooting experience, but this is the first full-frame camera that I've ever owned. So all of my opinions in terms of low light performance, overall image quality and all that are coming from the perspective of a lifelong APS-C shooter. But with all of that out of the way, let's get into my experience using this camera for the past 12 months or so. And to give this review a bit of a structure, I decided to go with the good old, the good, the great, the bad and the ugly format, and then give you my conclusion at the end. Obviously, there's a bunch of good stuff to mention about this camera, but most of it is pretty obvious, so I keep it short. The 28mm f1.7 Summilux lens is wonderful. The image quality is great overall, and it is probably the right choice in terms of focal length if you just need one lens to do it all, with a bit of a focus on lifestyle documentary shooting. The only reason that I mentioned this 28mm lens in the good category and not in the great category is because me personally, I would actually prefer to have a 35mm on here. But again, that's just me, and I do acknowledge that 28mm is probably the better choice if you need one lens to do it all. Also, with the 28mm focal length, you can always crop into your images, but you can't go any wider if you have a 35mm and you need more field of view. So there's that. I also do love the 47 megapixel full frame sensor, and if you pair that with the relatively fast lens as well as in-body image stabilization that this camera offers, you end up with a camera that pumps out very high quality photos with very admirable low light performance. Now, if you've watched other reviews about the Leica Q2, there is always a bunch of talk about how much worse the low light performance is compared to its predecessor, which only had 20 megapixels. And I absolutely do believe that that is true, but again, for me personally, as someone who's previously only used APS-C cameras, the low light performance is actually quite outstanding. So I guess it's a matter of perspective, but for me, the low light performance has not been an issue whatsoever. But if you, on the other hand, are actually coming from a fairly modern full frame camera with about 20 megapixel or so, your mileage may vary. I've also decided to include the Leica look in this category. Now, some might argue that this is not actually a thing and that it simply doesn't exist, but I would beg to differ. I think it does exist, and what it basically means is that you get those deep blacks with fairly saturated and punchy colors and a contrasty look overall. Now, some of that is definitely down to the lens's character, and a lot of it is for sure also down to Leica's color science. And with that being said, you can do so much with RAW files these days that this is a look that you could certainly also achieve with other cameras. But it does come very easy and very naturally with this camera and with the files that you get out of this camera, and that is something that I do value. Aside from that, in terms of usability, I do like the well-structured menus. This should probably not be noteworthy, but I really think that the menus are clean and very well structured. Along the same lines, I do think that it is very noteworthy and admirable that this camera still gets firmware updates that add major functionality improvements. If you want to learn more about the most recent firmware update at the time of recording this video, I got you covered. There's a video for you linked below in the description right next to that like button. Lastly, in terms of the good aspects of this camera, I was also positively surprised by its battery performance. I mean, it's not outstanding, but in my experience it has been very decent. And that is a good thing if you consider how much a spare battery for this camera costs. But with all of that out of the way, let's continue by talking about what's actually great about this camera. Now there are many great aspects to this camera, but honestly, what I probably most enjoyed is just how rugged this thing is. It might not look like it, being the cleanly designed and aesthetically pleasing piece of equipment that it is, but it can certainly take a beating. And it really doesn't care what elements you put it in. As I said in the intro, I have carried it pretty much every day over the past year, and that includes my day-to-day life, as well as a bunch of traveling. I took this camera to New York City in the winter, where it was cold and rainy all of the time. It's been to Iceland, where it got wet and then froze. It's been to Italy in August in 35 degrees Celsius plus heat. It has been blasted by sand on the beach in the Netherlands multiple times. It's been in high altitudes in the Swiss Alps, and it has been rained on and thrown around in my day-to-day life so many times that I couldn't count it. And it hasn't missed a single beat. Now there was that one situation in Iceland where I actually did think that this might have finally given in because it refused to focus. But as it turned out, I was just being an idiot. It was completely my fault. I simply accidentally switched the mode ring so that it was in a position somewhere between macro and regular mode, and therefore the camera refused to focus. All I had to do was put it back into its regular position and it worked completely fine, no big deal. Because of the fact that this camera is as robust as it is, I have never felt like I had to put it away to protect it from the elements, and because I don't have to think about this stuff, I can just use it and can get photos that I would probably not have gotten otherwise. Now that's not to say that other cameras aren't as robust, but having this level of ruggedness in a well-designed and relatively small package with this level of image quality is pretty sweet. Aside from the functionality, I do think that the overall design of this camera is certainly one of its greatest assets. I mean, it's not as beautiful as something like the Leica M10P, which, especially in the silver colorway, is just drop dead gorgeous if you ask me. And my wife actually insists that the Fuji X100V in silver that I had previously was also a better looking camera, but still I think there's no discussion about it. This is certainly a good looking camera. And if you don't like the standard all black design with the red Leica dot, don't worry, by now there are probably around 1 billion special limited edition runs with all sorts of designs and colorways for you to choose. I'm honestly not sure how I feel about all of those special limited edition runs that Leica does nowadays, especially with the Leica Q2. It sort of reminds me about Omega's thing with the Speedmaster, but oh well, there are certainly some good looking special editions in the mix, so I guess why not. Speaking of the design though, I also do really appreciate the overall very minimalistic design language on this camera in terms of its functionality. Almost all of the dials and buttons on this camera are directly related to your exposure settings, meaning your shutter speed, aperture and ISO. Other function and menu buttons are kept to a bare minimum, and that works perfectly fine. Yes, this is probably not the way you'd want it if you were to use this in a fast-paced professional setting. But for its intended use case, at least in my opinion, it's just about perfect. Now the last great aspect to this camera that I definitely wanted to mention is the overall quality and the attention to detail. I think by now I've probably said enough about the quality side of things, but just to reiterate that, it works great. And you can also immediately feel the quality of this camera from the moment you first pick it up. There are also other examples of the quality that are a bit more tangible, like the fact that the lens hood thread is made in such a way that every single time you put it on, it locks into place in exactly the right position. Not slightly wonky, not upside down, exactly right, every time. And there are of course also other reasons, like the fact that this has barely any sign of wear on it, even after traveling half the globe and being used out and about in some rough conditions. Everything about this camera, how it feels, how it looks, how it sounds, is just nice. So aside from just being a very capable tool, it is also just a joy to use. But that's enough of the high praise. Let's switch gears and talk about what's bad about this camera. Okay, I gotta be honest, I had a bit of trouble picking out the bad aspects of this camera because most of the things that I'm going to list are kind of non-issues in my opinion, but still, here we go. First of all, despite being comparatively small for a full-frame camera, it's still not as compact as something like the Fuji X100V, at least without the lens hood or a conversion lens attached, and it is also apparently slightly bigger than its closest rival, the Sony RX1R Mark II. The Q2 certainly has a leg up on the Fuji or something like a Ricoh in other areas, but if all you want is a compact travel camera that doesn't get in the way and portability is more important to you than other stuff like sensor size and weather resistance, then I would highly suggest looking into those other alternatives. That would also save you a bunch of money, which neatly leads us to our second bad point about this camera, which is its price. Now at the time of recording this video, this camera is listed on B&H for $5,795 and here in Germany you can currently buy it for about 5,650 euros, which is quite a bit of money. There's no discussion about it. And it's also quite a bit more than what I paid for it about a year ago. I paid less than 5,000 euros for this camera, which also wasn't exactly cheap, but at the very least I was able to convince the guy to throw in an extra battery, which, as I said previously, is also not cheap. Obviously, I do know that inflation is an issue for companies like Leica, but that is one steep price hike in just a year. Honestly, my best guess is that they are doing it because they can and because there seems to be an ever-growing demand for this camera and for Leica overall as a brand. So I guess good for them. For you and me as consumers, we just have to decide if this camera is worth the price tag for us or not and how much that sort of money, almost 6 grand, is to you. But objectively speaking, in terms of its features and its technology and what else is out there on the market, I certainly think that this costs more than it absolutely has to. Yes, there are also other factors involved, because Leica is obviously a niche brand and doesn't have the same resources as other companies such as Canon or Sony, and also the quality of their cameras is extremely high. They probably do have quite high labor costs, comparatively speaking, because of the countries in which they manufacture their cameras. But at the end of the day, I think there's no getting away from the fact that Leica is, after all, a luxury brand. They do make luxury products and they do price their products as such. Me personally, to be completely honest, I do not mind that at all, but for some people apparently it's a negative, so I thought that I probably should still include it here. In terms of other negatives, let's talk about the ergonomics. I honestly never had any issues, which is why I do not have a hand grip or a thumb stud on this camera, but I've heard other people say that this camera is pretty much unusable without these add-ons, so it's at least worth mentioning it, I guess. This camera is also not particularly good at shooting video. Leica has, thankfully, added more and more video capabilities over time by releasing new firmware updates, but I think it's still not as capable as it could be. With the latest firmware update, you can now actually record 10-bit 4:2 video footage, but sadly, there is still no way to record Leica log and the autofocus is not great, especially for a camera that costs this much. But hey, if all you want is to get a couple of atmospheric shots here and there, and regarding the autofocus, you can always just switch to single shot autofocus or manual focus to get away from that annoying focus hunting. But overall, again, even with the latest firmware updates, this is not a great camera in terms of video functionality. One of the main gripes I had with this camera when I first got it, coming from a Fuji X100V, was the auto white balance, and while it is still not great, I have certainly gotten used to it over time. For one, I actually do feel like it has gotten better since the last firmware update, even though it wasn't mentioned anywhere in the firmware release notes. But more than that, I've simply switched to editing my RAW files in Lightroom, which I haven't done previously with the Fuji X100V because I was so satisfied with the JPEGs that I got out of this camera. But if you're editing your RAW images in Lightroom, getting the white balance right on the spot is actually not all that important, and if the camera gets it wrong, you can always just fix it in post. And while we're talking about JPEGs, The JPEG quality in terms of the look and how much you can stylize it is, in my opinion, still not on par with what Fuji offers with their custom recipes, but it has gotten quite a bit better, and I do especially like the features that they added with the most recent firmware update. But again, I've simply switched over to editing all of my photos in Lightroom, and while I'm certainly not the greatest at editing photos in Lightroom and I do have a lot to learn, I'm quite happy with the results that I'm able to achieve. And those were actually all of the bad points that I could think of. And also, there's nothing about this camera that I would describe as ugly. Now, for some people, the price tag would certainly fall into that category, and I do absolutely get that. This camera is certainly not the best in terms of value for money, but it is what it is, and that doesn't really bother me too much. Luckily, I am currently in a position where I can afford this camera, but even a few years ago, when I was still a broke university student and I couldn't even dream of buying a camera that is this expensive, the fact that some stuff that is non-essential to life was too expensive for me to afford simply never bothered me. For me, those things honestly were always just things I could strive for. So in regards to the price tag, it's great if you can afford it. If not, no worries, there are a bunch of other cameras on the market, and in certain aspects these cameras are probably also more capable than the Leica Q2. In conclusion though, even 1 year later, I'm still very much in love with this camera, and I have not regretted spending this kind of money at all. The Q2 has certainly spoiled me in the sense that I do think about upgrading the rest of my Fuji cameras to a full frame interchangeable lens setup, and I may or may not have actually just ordered a Sony a7 IV. But with all that being said, I would still have a hard time buying the Leica Q2 again if I were to lose or break it. And that is for the simple fact that it has gotten almost 1,000 euros more expensive over the last year or so, and it certainly wasn't cheap to begin with. I mean, this is a tech product, and by now this is 3-year-old technology in this camera. So if I were to actually lose or break it, I would like to say that I would hold out and just wait until the Leica Q3 is released, but in all honesty, I would probably come crawling back to Leica within 2 weeks or so to get another Q2, because God only knows when the Q3 will be released, especially as long as the Q2 is in such high demand. So yeah, again, even after 1 year, I'm still very much in love with this camera. I hope this video has been interesting and helpful to you. If it was, let me know by giving it a thumbs up. If you want to see more of the images that I shoot on this camera, follow me on Instagram, linked in the description below, and subscribe for more camera, EDC or travel related content. I got a bunch of ideas for new videos, plus that Sony a7 IV that I got on order, and I'm certainly going to compare that camera to the Fuji X-T4 and the Leica Q2. So again, subscribe if that is something that you would like to see. But for now, that is all I got for you today. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, take care. Bye bye.